What do stage curtains, a horse, and a pinky ring have in common? You're about to find out in this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot. This is part 3 of our Pearl Bryan series. If you haven't listened to parts 1 or 2 yet, you definitely need to go back.
Yeah, this one won't make a whole lot of sense if you have no idea what happened in the beginning.
As for the rest of you, we left off on February 15th of 1896, and before we head all the way back there, I'm going to take you to February 28th instead.
How poor Pearl Bryan did mourn as he drove from Cincinnati to the place where the deed was done.
The curtain lifted, and William Wood was astonished. Right before him was Pearl Bryan in the flesh, and Scott Jackson. The scene depicted the two of them speaking to each other. Will leaned toward the reporter standing beside him.
That is a very good Pearl Bryan, and it looks like Jackson, but it's too tall.
The curtain dropped. The spectators heard quiet footsteps behind the canvas as the actors changed position. A moment later, the curtain rose again. This time, Alonzo Walling had joined the scene. Will nodded and commented that this looked quite a bit like him as well. The curtain dropped again, then lifted to show another scene. These living pictures were walking spectators through the Pearl Bryan tragedy. Picture after picture reenacted what the public believed had happened that cold January night. The curtain dropped for the last time. The sound of soft footsteps again, then silence. The curtain rose for the final time. On the platform lay a headless body. Will gasped. Once he regained his composure, he walked over to the cab, which they believed was the one that drove Pearl to the murder scene. Chester Mullen had agreed to lend it to them for a week as part of their Pearl Bryan tragedy exhibit. I don't know whether Will took one or not, but every visitor that day received a free copy of a newly composed ballad about Pearl Bryan. The reporter stated that this was Souvenir Day at the museum. Will seemed fascinated by the exhibit. According to the reporter, he even remarked that he'd be back the next day. Now, this wasn't a dream. It wasn't a courtroom demonstration. It wasn't a rehearsal. This was a perfectly ordinary Friday afternoon at the Heck and Avery's New Dime Museum located on Vine Street in Cincinnati. Pearl Bryan had been dead for only a month. She was murdered January 31st, and Will made this visit on February 28th. The murder hadn't even been fully investigated, and already it had become a spectacle. People flocked to the Heck and Avery's museum every day, and the owners of the museum did their best to bring in fresh, new, exciting exhibits week after week.
Step right up, step right up. Visit Heck and Avery's New Dime Museum and Family Theater on Vine Street. A wonder awaits around every corner. Marvel at the celebrated living pictures of the Pearl Bryan tragedy. View the very horse and rockaway carriage said to have carried the unfortunate girl on her final journey. Witness Nathu, the renowned Brahmin of Lucknow, India, whose astonishing basket mystery and miraculous mango tree have amazed audiences throughout the country. See him as he continues his extraordinary search for Pearl Bryan's missing head. Experience marvelous curiosities from every corner of the globe. Marvels, mysteries, music, wonders. And next week, don't miss the celebrated Fat Girl Wood Sawyers in the Grand Wood Sawing Contest for prizes, along with Wendy Van Houten's Great Rube Circus. New attractions every week, only at Heck and Avery's New Dime Museum and Family Theater.
Typically, the ads we feature on Forgotten Felonies are word-for-word readings from actual vintage newspaper ads. What you just heard is not an actual ad. While I did write the words for that strange advertisement, I did not make up any of the exhibits therein. They really did have Fat Girl Wood Sawyers the following week, and the week after that, they had Fat Girls on Stilts.
Welcome to 1896.
Yep. So by the end of February 1896, it seemed as though everyone had something to say about the Pearl Bryan case. Detectives had their theories, reporters had theirs, and of course Jackson and Walling had different stories. Psychics, hypnotists, ministers, lawyers, and complete strangers all insisted that they knew what had happened. The newspapers printed every rumor they could get their hands on. Songs were being written. Museums were staging reenactments. And while thousands of curious spectators paid admission to watch actors recreate Pearl Bryan's final days, investigators were still trying to answer a much more important question. What had actually happened that night? To answer that question, we need to go back to where we left off. Where we ended last time, it was Saturday, February 15th, 1896. Officer Swain was stopped by a man named George H. Jackson on the street.
There isn't much information about George H. Jackson available, and unfortunately, this is probably because he was a black man. We know that George was a very respectable man with a great reputation. On March 19th, 1894, George enlisted in the National Guard in Springfield, Ohio. Sometime in 1895, he moved to Cincinnati, but he still wanted to continue with the National Guard. He continued reporting for duty in Springfield, and after living in Cincinnati for a while, George wrote to Major Johnstone and let him know that he'd organized an independent military company for black men and asked the major if he could help them get admitted to the 9th Battalion. Technically, this had not been done by February 1896, but it was named the Caldwell Guards, and George acted as a commanding officer. Many people joined this company, and they were welcomed at the local armory.
Yep. So George asked Officer Swain whether a cab driver would get in trouble if someone had forced him to drive at gunpoint. And Officer Swain thought this was a very peculiar question, and so he pressed the matter. And after assuring George that he would be protected if he had a story to tell, George agreed to go to the station and give a statement. When he got there, he was asked if he knew anything about the carriage that had taken Pearl Bryan toward Fort Thomas, and George looked at the officer and replied,
Yes, I know all about it.
And then George told his story. The Caldwell Guards had been conducting a military drill on the evening of Friday, January 31st. When it was over, George and 4 other men were walking together. When they got to the intersection of Elm and George Streets, they encountered a man wearing a white cap. The stranger walked up to the group and said,
Which one of you fellas wants to make $5?
He told them he needed a ride to Newport, Kentucky. None of the 4 men standing with George were interested, so George said he would do it. And his day job, after all, was as a coachman for a prominent member of the community. The man told George to wait there for about half an hour and he'd be back with the rig that he wanted George to drive. George waited for about 45 minutes before the man arrived again with a surrey and a gray horse. It was after midnight by this time, maybe around 12:20 if his guess was correct. The man said,
All right, bud, I'm ready.
Then the man got into the closed carriage while George got into the driver's seat. The horse was very high-spirited, he said. The horse held its head up as though it was reined up tight, he said. George had a very hard time holding him. George noticed that the curtains were drawn on the closed carriage and he couldn't see inside of it at all, but they started off toward Newport, Kentucky. He first drove south on Elm to 3rd Street, then turned east on 3rd and went to Broadway. This led them to the bridge that would cross over to Kentucky. Just as they approached the bridge, he was told to slow way down. While he was still at a slow roll, the man with the white cap got out of the carriage and climbed up onto the seat beside George.
As I was driving along, I heard a funny noise in the back of the surrey, a sort of muffled sound, something like a woman might make if she was suffering with a toothache. They had told me there was 2 physicians taking a patient home.
George felt uneasy and thought something might be wrong. When they were in front of the Robinson and Sons distillery, he made a move to get out of the surrey, and he says that the man beside him then pulled out a revolver and put it to his head. He said,
"If you try to jump out of here, I'll send you to hell."
George continued driving the rig, now positive that something wasn't right, and he continued to hear those eerie moans coming from the carriage. When they came up near the residence of Farmer Jest, the man beside him, who was still mad that he'd tried to get away, told him,
"We know your name and address, and if you ever say a word about this trip to anyone, we will kill you. There are 15 of our friends who will look after your case and do you if you say a word about it."
Wow.
Yeah. After a while, the man sitting beside him told him to stop. He told George that the patient's house was right down below there, but it was dark and George couldn't see anything. A man and a woman got out of the back. The two men began walking with her, both of them helping to support her because she was stooped forward and she was unable to walk on her own. One of the men told George to turn around and they'd whistle for him when they needed him. He realized they didn't want him to see what they were doing. They walked away a short distance, and then George heard a noise that sounded like a groan, like someone was in real misery. And George wasn't about to stay to see how the story ended, so he hurriedly climbed down, accidentally denting the lantern in the process. He pulled out a piece of iron rail that had been sitting in the surrey to be used as a carriage weight, and he hitched the horse to it. From there, George ran. He ran the entire way until he reached the other side of that bridge. Once he was in Cincinnati, he felt far less afraid and he walked the rest of the way home. And he said he got to his residence sometime between 3 and 4 a.m. After listening to this story, a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer went to Scott Jackson's cell and told him that they had found the driver. He was told, "The jig is up, you might as well come clean." Scott said he didn't know a damned thing about any driver. He said the cab stories were making him tired, and then he turned over and refused to talk anymore. Alonzo Walling told the reporter that the truth could be found in his own confession, and this cab driver they found was a liar. William Wood was still in jail at this time. He was told about it, and he was actually quite excited to hear the news that they had found the driver. It was after 11 p.m. when the guards woke everyone up and had them all gather in a common area. There were 50 men standing there, including Scott and Alonzo. George was brought in, and he weaved his way through all of the men. He pointed out Alonzo and asked if he could hear him speak. They had him say what the man with the gun had said to George.
"That's the man."
Then he walked around again. He took a long look at Scott Jackson and had him speak as well. He said he was the man who had been inside the carriage. These were the two men who he had taken to Fort Thomas. A reporter talked to Scott about it later, and Scott asked,
"What is this fellow trying to do?" "Here's the man who drove you to Fort Thomas." "Did they find the rig?" "No." "Then where does he come in?" "You had the rig and he got in at George and Elm Streets and drove you over." "That makes me sick. If we had the rig and the body in it, then why would we want him to drive it? He is like all the rest of the rubbernecks."
So he makes a good point. Why did they need to involve a driver if they could have just driven it themselves?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I also thought the same thing. Well, on February 19th, seriously, I was like stumped, like, yeah, why would they involve another witness? One of them could have driven, like they didn't need anyone else. But later on February 19th, there was this detective named Detective John T. Norris, and apparently he was really famous in the area. He was from a nearby county, and he spoke to a reporter, and he weighed in. His theory actually made a lot of sense. Now, of course, this is just his theory. I haven't even finished reading through this entire case yet, so I don't know if this ever, was proven or not. But he said that maybe they needed another person who they could frame as guilty. This detective thinks that they planned to murder George as well and stage things so it looked like George had attacked and killed Pearl and then he committed suicide. Norris thinks that they would have put the head in the valise and then had George drive them a bit of a distance, like back towards Cincinnati, and then they would shoot him, tie the horse to a tree, and then from there, Scott and Alonzo would walk the rest of the way back. There would be nothing to investigate, and the two charming dental students would go back to their lives as though nothing had happened. What are your thoughts?
That does make sense because of racial factors back in the day. They wouldn't have thought twice.
Yeah.
And they would have just blamed him.
That's true. Because they would have left the valise with her head, next to him. And so it would have been like, oh, clearly he did it. And they wouldn't have investigated anything.
But, and hear me out, George had witnesses with him, though.
That's true. Unless it's not. See, I don't even know for sure if he really was the driver. Because they try to find those witnesses and they can't find them. So, yeah, it's like, what is happening here? But the thing is, George's story never changed. Like, he told it again and again to this officer, then, reporters. Every single time it was exactly the same story. And they tried to trip him up, and he never, ever once, would...
Interesting.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Ayers cathartic pills. The woman, the man, and the pill. She was a good woman. He loved her. She was his wife. The pie was good. His wife made it. He ate it. But the pie disagreed with him, and he disagreed with his wife. Now he takes a pill after pie and is happy. So is his wife. The pill he takes is Ayers. Moral: avoid dyspepsia by using Ayers cathartic pills.
So by the time George was done telling his story on February 15th, it was time to call it a day and get some rest. The 16th was going to be a really big day for a lot of detectives. The rig described by George was a Rockaway coupe. The detectives scoured the city to find a livery stable with a Rockaway coupe and a horse that matched the description given by George. They went to every livery stable in Cincinnati, and they came up empty. Detectives McDermott and Krim then went to Walnut Hills and spoke to a Sergeant Werner and Patrolman Patrick White. They said that they had a pretty good idea about where that rig may have come from. So the four of them went to the Walnut Hills Cab Company, owned by Chester P. Mullen and located at 942 and 944 McMillan Street. There they found a Rockaway coupe and a gray horse. They asked Mr. Mullen if this particular rig had been out on the night of January 31st, and he said yes. The next step was to get George and see if he could identify things. He said yes, that was definitely the coupe he drove. He even pointed out the dent that he had left in the lantern.
Okay, that makes me feel like it is true. Because he did say before they found the cab that he left a dent in the lantern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it does sound very true. It does. So, Mr. Mullen actually had 2 gray horses. And so it was like, okay, let's see which one it is. They really wanted to test George to make sure that he, was not playing tricks on them. So they hooked up each horse one by one. And the first one that he drove, it was very calm. And he was like, no, this is not the horse from that night. They got the second one hooked up, and he was lunging and pulling and everything just like the horse that he had driven on that night, on, Friday the 31st. And wouldn't you know it, when they checked, that was indeed the horse that had been hitched to the Rockaway coupe that night. So it's all falling together.
Mm-hmm.
The coupe was then thoroughly searched. The detectives found 2 strands of blonde hair clinging to the seat. They also saw strange stains on the carpet on the floor, and they found a 5-inch-long pencil that looked like it had blood on it. This was later analyzed by a Professor Poole, and the stains on those 2 items were not blood. Then the reporter decided to do a search. He found a small black bead under the cushions of the back seat, which was identical to the beads found around Pearl's body. The beads had come from her hat. There were also 2 rusty hairpins and a small black pin.
Speaking of Pearl's hat, we totally skipped over this in the last episode. As it turns out, Very early on February 1st, the same day that Pearl's body was found, an ordinary milk peddler named Mrs. Mary Morgan had been driving her rig along the Alexandria Pike when she spotted something black on the side of the road. It was indeed a black hat with black feathers, some beadwork, small pink roses, and an olive ribbon. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It was lying on the ground with a very large rock on top of it, as if to keep it from blowing away. The papers said this rock was the size of 2 fists put together. Underneath the hat was a men's handkerchief covered in blood. Mrs. Morgan took it all home with her. She read about the body being found later on when the story hit the newsstands, and she didn't put the two together. After a few days, she brought it up to the wife of a saloon keeper. This woman had actually seen the hat lying on the side of the road as well, but she didn't pick it up. Well, the wife of the saloon keeper then told the story to a few other people. One man who heard the story was at a meeting on Saturday, February 8th, and saw that Sheriff Plummer was also attending. He told the sheriff about the finding of the hat, and it was the next afternoon, on the 9th, when detectives made their way to the home of Mrs. Morgan. Later that evening, around 8 o'clock p.m., Detectives Krim and McDermott, along with Sheriff Plummer, arrived at the Cincinnati jail. Remember, they are from Kentucky. They brought the prisoners in one at a time. First, they asked if they could describe the hat she was wearing, and then they showed them the hat that had been found. Both Scott and Alonzo identified it as Pearl Bryan's. Not only that, but Alonzo said that the handkerchief was one of Scott's.
Yeah, and during that particular examination, they asked Scott Jackson if the 3 handkerchiefs that had been in his pocket when he was arrested had belonged to Pearl. He had initially said that he had just randomly found them on a streetcar, but this time he admitted it. He said that the bloody handkerchief was not his, though. So, I'm sure. Anyway, back to George H. Jackson's story as the driver. On the evening of February 16th, George was being questioned about the Rockaway coupe itself. He said that everything was the same.
If it only had the curtain on the inside of the door, I would say it was the rig.
It turns out that it hadn't been a curtain on the inside of the door at all, but was instead a towel of some sort that was folded over the top. It wasn't fixed in place, so it all checked out. Well, they decided they needed to really test George to find out if he was telling the truth. They decided to have him make the drive again. They wanted him to leave around the same time, which was about 20 minutes after midnight. However, when they left, it was 12:50. But they wanted to see if he could retrace the route in the same dark conditions. The only difference between this night and that of January 31st was that now it was raining, and it hadn't been then. George was standing outside with the officers, chatting around 11 o'clock p.m., and suddenly he stopped talking and listened. He could hear the rattling of a carriage coming their way, and he instantly recognized it as the one he had driven. So it was after midnight, very early in the morning of Monday, February 17th, when they set off from City Hall to see what would happen. George was driving the lead vehicle, obviously, and a fleet of carriages carrying newsmen and other officers followed behind. One of the men coming along for the ride was Sheriff Plummer of Kentucky. He knew all of those Kentucky roads like the back of his hand, and he would know for sure if George had no idea where he was going. So they get to the toll booth in the middle of the bridge, and they stopped. An officer asked the toll booth worker if he remembered who had paid the toll that night. George said nobody paid the toll, but he thinks the man in the back had passed a carriage ticket through to pay the toll.
That would be a prepaid ticket they could use to cross the bridge.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly, Scott Jackson had 3 carriage tickets in his pocket when he was arrested. So George was leading the way and doing all the talking. He was going the right way until he got to a house and barn owned by Mr. John Lenner. He stopped and said he didn't remember that house, and he thought maybe they were going the wrong way. Now, Sheriff Plummer didn't say anything, but this actually made his blood boil. Had they continued on that road, it would have taken them exactly where they needed to go. The destination was literally 3/4 of a mile down that road. Now that George was turning them around, Sheriff Plummer was certain George had not made the drive that night, and he was really annoyed that he was being dragged along this goose chase. So they drove over creeks and they drove over culverts, and the roads were not great that night. They were soaking wet and extremely muddy. One of the carriages that was carrying reporters actually fell over and fell down a 7-foot bank. So all of the reporters were thrown out, and anyway, they had to get them all back up, pull it back up onto the road. So anyway, they did that, and then George kept going. There they go, down this road, until he made a turn on a road that Sheriff Plummer didn't even know about. And it took them directly to the Alexandria Pike. They had used a lantern for the last stretch of the drive, but they put it out before reaching the pike. The road that they were on came out past Fort Thomas, and so then they had to turn and go north a little bit to get to, the spot where the body was left. And George rode on, and when they got close to Farmer Locke's farm, he hesitated a little bit before stopping. He says he remembers the house on the hill, the 3-board fence with 1 board missing, and he remembers where they walked the girl into the nearby orchard. He had indeed found the location. He showed them where he had hitched the horse to a piece of railroad iron, and he showed them where he ran through the fields. George had passed this test. They couldn't find that piece of iron, though, that he had tied the horse to, so that was confusing. And also the hitch strap. They couldn't find that either. It wasn't in the cab when it had been returned. But anyway, so George repeated his story to multiple lawmen. He never changed a single detail. And now the police just needed to find the 4 men that had been standing with George when Alonzo Walling came looking for a driver. And it turns out this was not going to be easy.
So I understand wanting to be thorough, but I feel like they're being pretty unfair to him based on most likely race, which I find it annoying.
Well, something else that's super annoying. So all of the military people who knew George were, talking to reporters and saying, like, he is amazing. This guy is great. Like, very upstanding, very respectable, like, totally honest, blah, blah, blah. So then when all the people over in Springfield, Ohio heard, his name is in the paper and blah, 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 they started, like, publishing these stories about, like, oh, he tried to sue this guy for assault, but it didn't actually happen. And, like, he embezzled money from this employer. Like, they, were coming up with all of these stories. And then other people would come forward and say, actually, he didn't embezzle money at all, like, standing up for him. And they also had heard someone who was working with the defense. They actually hired a guy, a private investigator, to, like, purposely manufacture these stories to make it look like he couldn't be trusted, to discredit him. Now, I mentioned in the last episode that some things got a little wild for William Wood. If you may have forgotten, he is Pearl's first cousin once removed.
Yes, William was the son of Pearl's first cousin. However, they were very close in age and probably had the same relationship as first cousins would have. In February of 1896, William was 19 and Pearl would be 23.
All right, so I think it's time that we tell more of his story. You should all recall that Will had left Greencastle, Indiana, just a few days after Pearl left for Cincinnati. First, he went to Plymouth to party hard, and then he went to South Bend, Indiana, where he was going to be studying medicine.
Yeah, if he was going to stay in school this time.
Yeah, and I doubt it, looking at his history. But who knows what might have happened. Well, on the same day that the Kentucky lawmen were at the Lewis and Hayes shoe store in Greencastle, Indiana, the manager of the Wells Fargo telegraph office was paying a visit to the Greencastle authorities. His name was W.A. Early, and he had been shown letters that raised some red flags for him. These letters were written by Scott Jackson to Will Wood. One of the letters was written in late October of 1895, and it was shown to Mr. Early. It read as follows.
Hello, Bill. Sorry to hear Bert is in so bad a fix. Impress it upon her that it is all her own fault. You must stand by me in this, for you are the only one I can write to for help. Now, here is a prescription that I have never known to fail. Tell her to take 2 or 3 good hookers before going to bed. Tell her to take hip baths, I think these will bring her around all right. Now, Bill, here is the most important of all.
Now, in this next part, the newspaper stopped quoting and just explained that Scott Jackson then said that William Wood should, quote, endeavor to himself have the relations with Pearl that Scott himself had sustained.
So essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott was telling William to have relations of the sexual nature with his cousin.
Yes. And the paper went on to explain that Scott Jackson had said in the letter that such a relation would aid her toward getting out of her trouble.
How?
I don't know. I know that it can help, like, when you're, like, about to give birth. Like, it can induce labor. But, like, when you're 4.5 months, like, you know. So, yeah, the paper says that he should have sex with her. And then it starts quoting the letter again.
I think you can scare her into it. Now, Bill, don't go back on me. You know, if I can ever do anything for you, I will. I am always your chum. P.S. Be sure to do the last part I asked you to do, and be sure to burn this immediately.
Be sure, if anything, to have sex. Most important.
Yeah, with your cousin. Don't let me down. And I find this to be very interesting because of someone's story that comes up later. And I think maybe that's why he was like, oh no, it was Will who got her pregnant. I think he was trying to make it so that he could be like, it wasn't me. You know what I mean? Like, he slept with her. He did it. Which Will did not, by the way. Because Will was so disturbed by this letter. That's why he was showing people. When I first read this, I think the papers were interpreting it like he showed them, you know, these really lewd and terrible letters because he was bragging and, you know, kind of being like this, ha ha ha, like, look at this stuff. But no, he did it because he was very disturbed. So he showed this letter to Mr. Early. And he also took it to Dr. Gillespie, who Scott had worked for the previous summer in Greencastle. And it turns out that Dr. Gillespie had actually become suspicious of Scott and Pearl's relationship. And he had confronted Scott about it the previous summer. And Scott admitted that, yes, they had had, you know, inappropriate touching and all of that stuff. And Dr. Gillespie then told him that he needed to marry Pearl. So Scott did not like that very much, so he quit, found a new job, and he took a lot of Dr. Gillespie's tools with him.
No.
Yep. He's like, okay, I quit. And then, like, Dr. Gillespie comes in, and he's like, where's my stuff?
So we have a murderer, a liar, a thief.
Yeah, I mean, how manipulative is that, though? The whole, like, go have sex with her too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, and even though Will is his friend, like, they were friends, I don't think Scott, like, knows what it is to be an actual good friend.
Sounds like a narcissist.
Yeah, for sure. But, oh my gosh, just, I mean, to be like, oh, no, this will help. You have to do this. Promise me you'll do this. Just so he could be like, nope, it was him. Because he pointed at him at, like, right off the bat. Like, oh, this guy, I don't like him. Anyway. So, I mentioned this in the last episode, but when Dr. Gillespie saw this letter and that prescription, he told Will not to get involved at all. He said, you know, this is all really, really bad. It could get you in so much trouble. So, Will decided to just hand that paper with the prescription to Pearl and let her do with it whatever she wanted to do with it. There was another letter that Scott wrote on January 23rd, just 8 days before the murder. In this one, he was just pushing Will to get Pearl to Cincinnati. He said that he had a really nice room set up for her, an old lady would care for her, and Alonzo's friend would be performing the operation. And he told Will specifically, make sure that Pearl arrives on Monday night. And he ended this letter the same way as he ended all of his letters.
Be sure and burn this as soon as read.
The papers said that Will had actually shown these letters to 3 or 4 people. Like, that's how disturbing he found them. And so when the rumors started swirling in Greencastle that it just might be Pearl Bryan in a northern Kentucky morgue, Mr. Early realized just how close that was to Cincinnati, and he figured he ought to say something. Of course, by that time, Will was in South Bend, Indiana. He was arrested very early in the morning of February 6th and taken to Cincinnati, where he was charged with aiding in setting up an illegal operation. He was bonded out of jail on the 7th, and he and his father got onto a train headed for Greencastle. Will just wanted to go home. They arrived shortly after midnight, making it very early on February 8th. When they got home, Will's mom hugged him, crying, all of this stuff, and hardly anyone in the house got any sleep that night. But in the morning, things got really, really tense in Greencastle. People a few blocks away from their home were talking about how unwise it was for his father to have brought him back to Greencastle. Another reverend went to the Wood home and warned Will's father that it might be dangerous to have Will at home. As the morning went on, more and more people showed up at the house to warn them of danger. Men from out in the country were actually coming into town and gathering, like a mob was forming. City Marshal William Starr, he even went to the Woods' door and warned them that a lynch mob was forming and it wasn't safe. Will's dad had a few friends come over for some protection, and a Cincinnati Enquirer reporter showed up there around noon. About half an hour after the reporter left, Will and his parents hopped in their buggy and they went straight to the Vandalia Depot, which was the train depot. They met a couple more reverends there, and Will's mother kissed him and hugged him as she was sobbing, and then Will and his father and 2 other reverends got on the train and they headed back to Cincinnati, where he would stay hidden away and hopefully safe from lynch mobs. Now, Greencastle was pretty upset about this, that he left. They were pretty mad. And so on February 11th, 3 days after Will's escape from the lynch law, a letter was written and sent to the people of Newport, Kentucky. It arrived on the morning of February 12th, and it read,
To whom it may concern, this is to notify the people in and around Newport, Kentucky, that the people of Greencastle are ready to extend their aid in the punishment by lynch law of the murderous brutes Jackson, Walling, and Wood, for murdering in cold blood the unsuspecting girl, Pearl Bryan, who was decoyed and entrapped to her sad fate. These 3 fiends are as certainly guilty as the sun rises and sets. Wood left here suddenly Saturday to save his neck, which, he well knows, connects the head of a guilty dastardly brute. The friends here, as well as at the poor, unfortunate dead girl's family, plead for revenge and punishment of those 3 cowardly brutes and say, for God's sake, let it be granted them.
and it was signed, A Friend of Pearl's.
I honestly wonder what Pearl's family thinks. Like if they think William was as guilty as other people thought.
They do. They hate William.
Oh.
Absolutely, with a passion. They're like, it is his fault. He's the one who did this. He put her on the train sending her over there. He knew it was going to be an illegal operation. Like, this is his fault.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
A rift in the family.
Yeah. Yep. And it's crazy because Will later said it was like 2 or 3 times a week they would all visit each other because Will lived in town and they lived 2 miles out. And so, like, Will would go over there. They would go to his house. Like, they were really close. Which, I mean, would make that betrayal so much more terrible, to be like, your family, why would you do that? So, yeah. But yeah, at this point, they still think he probably had something to do with it. Some people actually thought that William Wood had probably, when he left, he probably went over there and he was there at the time of the murder. But he wasn't. But that's what a lot of people were thinking. So, as a reminder, William Wood had another court date coming up on February 13th. And when the court called for him, he didn't appear right away, and his bond was forfeited. He and his dad came rushing in almost immediately after that decision was made, but it was too late. The bond was gone, and Will had to be put in jail again until another bond could be collected. The second bond was set at $5,000, but this time his dad and attorneys decided that jail might be the best place for him, and so they did not pay it. And his case was continued until February 25th. Well, at the February 25th hearing, his bond was reduced from $5,000 to $3,000, and they set the next court date for April 15th. Will was pretty sure he'd get out soon and also pretty sure that his whole case would be dismissed eventually. Like, this is all a mix-up. I really didn't do anything. And on the day after that hearing, February 26th, there was an interview with Will's father, published in The Beacon and Republican out of Akron, Ohio. And in this interview, Reverend D.M. Wood spoke about all of the indecent letters written by his son.
I have no apology for the letters. They were as great a revelation to me when I read them in Mayor Caldwell's office as they were to anyone else. I did not consider him capable of using such language. They struck me as being profane and coarse rather than as vulgar and indecent. They appear to be such as a boy might write who wished to appear as bad as someone else. And it is plain to anyone who will study them that they were exaggerated and unnatural. They are clearly the result of Jackson's unfortunate influence over my boy.
The Reverend went on to talk about all of the ill will toward his son and said that it was becoming much more mild as the days went on. He said that Pearl's brother, Fred, was probably the only one that still hates him to his core. And then Reverend D.M. Wood went on to say that it was Pearl Bryan's fault for inducing his son to bring her and Jackson together the previous summer.
It was only after 3 or 4 weeks of urging on Pearl's part that Will consented to take Scott Jackson out to Pearl's home.
Now hold on there. Let's take a minute. What?
Yeah. You know, I would have expected someone who's this high up reverend with the Methodist Episcopal Church. I would have thought he would have been a little more down to earth, you know? But
then again, this is 1900 or 18.
Yeah.
No, 1800s.
1896.
Not even the 20th century.
Yeah, but yeah, it's like, well, it was her fault. She's, you know, if she hadn't begged and begged to meet him, none of this would have happened. My son is innocent. His hands are clean. So, pretty weird. He also said something else very interesting. He said that Will's mind was corrupted by Scott Jackson and that Scott would talk to Will about all of the women that he was sleeping with, but that Scott pointed out that these were not lewd women or sex workers, but they were instead good girls who he had seduced from the path of virtue.
Now, how does the dad know that?
He read the letters. And, of course, talked to Will.
So he was bragging about meticulously manipulating and breaking down the will of these straight-laced girls. To him, a sport.
Mm-hmm, exactly. He was a serious douchebag. Anyway, Scott Jackson is the guy that your fathers warn you about.
Guys like Scott Jackson are the reason fathers open the front door with shotguns when a date shows up for his daughter.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It is Scott Jackson.
Scott Jackson would have been a skunk.
Yes. 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 Because I actually thought of that this morning. Because he was abandoning her and his baby boy. I wonder if it ever crossed his mind that he had a son that he had just killed. You know what I mean? Like, Did it ever cross his mind, or was it just her trouble? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's so crazy to think about. But anyway, after that interview was published, Reverend D.M. Wood now had an enemy, Alexander Bryan, the father of Pearl. 2 days after Will's bond was reduced, his father and one of his attorneys posted the bond, and Will Wood was once again free. He was out on the streets of Cincinnati on February 27th, 1896, and it was the next day when Will walked into the Heck and Avery's new dime museum on Vine Street, where he encountered the exhibit known as Pearl Bryan's Tragedy. So you can see by the end of February, William Wood was no longer the public enemy that he had been just a few weeks earlier, and investigators were becoming increasingly convinced that he may have just been used by Scott Jackson rather than acting alongside him. But there was still another young person whose name kept surfacing in newspaper columns, and her name was Mae Smith. The police first heard her name on February 6th when they'd arrested Alonzo Walling. On one of his pinkies, he was wearing a woman's ring. The police were very interested in this, obviously, because Pearl's body was missing 2 rings that she had been wearing, and they assume they must have just been pawned. Well, Alonzo assured them the ring belonged to a friend of his, May Smith, and they took the ring into evidence anyway because, you can't just believe a guy like that. May Smith arrived in Cincinnati from Louisville on Tuesday, February 11th. She went to police headquarters and said that she wanted her ring back. They asked her some questions, and she said that she had never seen nor heard of Pearl Bryan. She said that Alonzo had never mentioned her at all. She was able to secure an order for the ring from the station, which she then took over to the jail, and she got her ring back. Now, most people would have gone home after this, but May Smith didn't. She decided to remain in Cincinnati. She got a room at the Indiana house under the alias Maria Swain. When a reporter found her and she finally agreed to talk, it was February 18th. May Smith met Alonzo Walling at the end of October 1895 when she went to the Ohio Dental College to get her teeth filled, and he filled 10 teeth for her over the next 2 weeks. And then she had met Scott Jackson as well. So after this, she saw Scott and Alonzo quite frequently. She and Alonzo actually became very intimate, she said, and for some reason, she lent him one of her rings on December 1st. On December 31st, May ran into Alonzo at the Imperial Concert Hall and realized he was acting kind of funny. So she went to his room the next day, hoping to get her ring back, but he wasn't there. And at the time, he had been staying in a room at Carlisle and John Streets, she said. So it was like before moving in with Scott Jackson. So she spoke with one of his classmates and roommates, Mr. Hackelman, and he told her that Alonzo had gone back to Hamilton, Ohio because a family member was sick. And I know his brother lived there. Now, the next Tuesday, January 7th of 1896, May Smith and a friend of hers, Hattie Gans, were eating lunch at Hyder's Hotel. They saw both Scott and Alonzo sitting across the way, and May told Hattie that she would introduce her to Scott if she wanted to, and apparently Hattie was like, oh heck yeah, look at that hottie. By the time the girls went to the table, Alonzo had already left, but Scott was still there. So they get to talking, and then May, Hattie, and Scott all walked around town for a while. May then asked Scott why Alonzo had been acting so funny, and he told her that he would tell her later. Well, fast forward to the following Monday, which was January 13th, and things get a little more exciting. May Smith and Scott Jackson went to a saloon on Elm Street between 5th and 6th Streets. It was about 5:00 p.m. They went to the upper floor of the saloon, and Scott proceeded to get very, very drunk off of whiskey. While Scott was drunk, he told May that Alonzo had left the city because he'd gotten a woman in trouble, which means pregnant. Scott then said that he himself had performed 2 abortions before. One time, he and a friend were crossing a ferry, and there was a girl in the corner of the boat, and Scott tried flirting with her, and then she attempted to jump off the ferry to commit suicide. So, it makes me wonder, like, ew, stop flirting with me, I'd rather die. But anyway, but that's not why she did it. But he says he stopped her twice, and she was arrested when they got to shore, and then the next day, he took her to his room, and he kept her there for 3 days because he saw that she was pregnant, hence the attempted suicide, and so he performed the abortion for her. So May said that after he told her about this, he asked her,
You remember me telling you about a girl named Pearl Bryan in Greencastle?
She said no. Then he went on to say that he and Will Wood had both gotten her in trouble, and they didn't know which one of them was the father. Scott said that he got a letter from Will saying that he was sending her to Cincinnati.
If she comes, I will put her out of the way. I won't fool with her. I'll give her some stuff that will fix her.
And all of that lingo, just as a reminder, is how people said they were going to kill someone in 1896.
Indeed it was. Now, shortly after May had this conversation with Scott, She left for Louisville, where she was starting a job at a sewing school, teaching the Dixie system of dress cutting. The school was owned by a Mr. and Mrs. Lister, and she was boarding with them. It was February 3rd when she received a letter from Scott that said something like,
You remember I spoke to you about the girl Pearl Bryan and told you that Wood was going to send her to Cincinnati. Well, he sent her here. I told you I intended to put her out of the way if she came here. I really did not mean those words, but I gave her too much stuff and I saw that it was killing her. I thought she was dead. You can imagine where we were, at that woman's house. I knew I had to do something to keep from being caught. I got a vehicle and a black man to drive it. I told Walling that he would have to help me, and he refused. I insisted, and Walling finally helped me to put the girl in the vehicle. We drove to Fort Thomas, and I cut her head off. For God's sake, whatever you do, destroy this letter as soon as you read it.
He really he's not good at keeping secrets.
No. But he knows that he's saying really bad stuff because he's like, burn it, destroy this, as soon as you read it, get rid of it. Because he knows it would be evidence.
Yeah, but it's also like, that's what a journal's for. And then you can burn it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, he kind of tells his business to a lot of people. Now, if Scott Jackson really had written this letter before anyone even knew that Pearl Bryan was dead, then it would amount to a confession that could send him straight to the gallows. Not only that, but it cleared Alonzo Walling of any wrongdoing. So May first claimed that she burned the letter. Then she claimed she hid the letter beneath her mattress. But when she returned to Cincinnati after the arrests, she forgot it was there. She says she later wrote to the Listers and asked them to destroy it.
So, did the police try to go find it?
Well, of course they were hot on that trail when they read May's story in the paper the next day. When the Listers were asked about the letter, they said she had not contacted them and asked them to destroy anything. They're like, that's weird. Didn't happen. However, they found, the police, questioning people, they found that the young lady who was responsible for cleaning out May's room when she moved out, she did find some letters under the mattress, and she just burned them along with all the other papers that had been left in the room.
Woof.
I know. So, they have no idea if it was real or not. After May shared all of this with the reporter brought up an anonymous letter that Mayor Caldwell had received that very morning. It said that May Smith wasn't who she said she was. She was actually married. She had a young son. Shortly after her wedding, she slept with another man who her father then killed. Her husband forgave her, but then she left him a second time to run off with Alonzo Walling. And the writer, the anonymous writer, gave May's maiden name, listed other names of her relatives. And so they were like, is this really about you? And she was like, oh, no, none of that's about me. And she said that Alonzo knew another woman named May Smith, so it must have been about her.
I don't like the sound of this gal. Is this the girl I found?
I don't know.
Emma Sue Roberts was who he was engaged to.
I haven't seen that name yet.
Well, she apparently visited him a lot.
Really? I wonder why the reporters didn't pick up on that. Unless it was later. Keep in mind, I haven't even finished reading through March. So maybe she starts visiting at the end of March.
This is like Hans Schmidt, except you're really into this one.
Yeah, this one's not nearly as gross. Not at all, except the whole hey, you should sleep with your cousin thing. Good thing Will was like, I don't think so.
This might be 1800s America in the somewhat Midwest South, but no.
Will was progressive in that regard. Thanks, but no thanks. So after the interview, May and the reporter both went to the jail where May had a visit with Alonzo Walling. She gave him some cigars and they talked for a long time, but the reporter actually couldn't hear what they were saying. He couldn't hear their conversation. Next, she went to Scott's cell to visit him. This time, the reporter could hear the entire conversation, and they just talked about regular stuff. How's the weather? Do you like it in jail? Like, just regular things. And when they left, the reporter asked May if Scott had mentioned the letter to her, the one in which he confessed to the crime, and she said yes. She said,
"He asked me if I had them, and I answered that I had a part of them. He understood this. He asked me if I intended to stick by him, and I said I would."
Interestingly, the reporter had heard their entire conversation, and none of that was said at all.
It sounds like she likes Scott more than Alonzo.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, she was sleeping with Alonzo.
And Scott. They went to that private bedroom.
The upstairs in the saloon. Probably, yeah.
Why slave at a washboard when Conroy's washer will relieve you of 9/10 the work? In a few years, the washboard will be seen in dime museums as a curiosity, just as the spinning wheel is. It requires no lye. It does not rub the clothes. It leaves no lint in the tub. It does not tear the clothes because it works on the suction and pressures principle. It washes a tub full of clothes in 5 minutes. It saves hours of drudgery and backache. You can sit down on the tub and rest while operating the washer. Every woman will want Conroy's popular washer after she has seen its work. No other washer compares with it. Call it Conroy's Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock and see the work done by Conroy's wonderful washing machine. Price, $10. It pays to trade at Conroy's.
While May Smith was making herself known in Cincinnati, things were getting very exciting over in Indianapolis. On the morning of February 9th, just 3 days after the arrests, Marshal William E. Starr, back in Greencastle, Indiana, received a letter. This letter said that a woman named Lulu May Hollingsworth, who lived at number 1 Henry Street in Indianapolis, could tell the police all about the murder. It said that they might have to really push her, but she would likely talk. It also said that if they showed her this letter, show it to Lulu, she would recognize the author's initials, and that itself would be a good sign to her that the time had come to finally spill the beans. And the letter was signed with just 3 initials, H-E-R. Marshal Starr was very excited about this lead. He went straight to Indianapolis and touched base with Superintendent Colbert, Chief of Detectives Splann, and Detective Watson. And then all 4 of them went together to meet Miss Lulu May Hollingsworth. The 4 men entered the boarding house on Henry Street, and someone went to fetch Lulu. She recognized Marshal Starr the moment that she walked into the room, and then she quickly rushed over to the stove and threw a letter into the fire. Lulu was questioned for over 2 hours. She told the officers that she knew Scott Jackson and William Wood, but she'd never met Alonzo Walling. Lulu said that she ran into Pearl accidentally on Tuesday, January 28th, when Lulu accidentally wound up at the Union Depot.
It's interesting that she said it was on January 28th because we now know she would have been there on the 27th. But please, Monica, go on.
Pearl Bryan told Lulu, according to Lulu, that she was on her way to Cincinnati to meet Scott Jackson. Lulu apparently already knew that Pearl was pregnant, and that's what they started talking about. Pearl said that she was heading over to Cincinnati to be rid of her burden and to prevent any disgrace from falling on her family. Pearl then asked Lulu if she could get her the necessary medications that could terminate her pregnancy. Lulu would not admit to the officers that she did anything of the sort, but she did say that the medicines were obtained there in Indianapolis at that time. She named 3 different drugstores where the medicines were purchased, to avoid any suspicion. The police superintendent really pressed her and wanted to know if she herself bought the drugs and gave them to Pearl.
I will not answer that. No judge can compel anybody to talk if their testimony criminates themselves. That much I know about the law. Neither will I tell what kind of medicine was procured, save that whiskey was one of the ingredients. It should have taken effect in 9 hours. She basically just admitted it.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, she said actually criminates, not incriminates. That's the word that they used. Miss Hollingsworth said that she'd known Pearl from Greencastle, and also while Miss Hollingsworth was a student at the Coates College in Terre Haute. Also during the questioning, they got out of her that there had been, quote, an occurrence
between me and Jackson and the dead girl, but that I will not speak unless it becomes necessary to save the 2 boys from hanging. I know how she died, at least I think I do. She took the medicine and went to Jackson's room, where Jackson found her in a dying condition. Hoping to save himself, he cut off her head and threw it into the river.
What communication have you had with Jackson since this affair?
None.
She was then asked what was in the letter that she'd thrown into the fire, and she refused to answer that. The police were convinced it was likely an incriminating letter written by Scott Jackson. Lulu also told the officers that she had met William Wood, Pearl's cousin, in Indianapolis when he was on his way to South Bend on Friday, January 31st. Marshall Starr then had a theory that perhaps Will had gone to Indianapolis earlier and arranged for Miss Hollingsworth to get the medicine, and when he stopped on January 31st, he was checking to make sure that she had done it. She was asked if she recognized the initials H.E.R. that were signed on the letter, and she said it was Hal E. Ratcliffe, who she had apparently once been engaged to. The police tried to track him down, and while they first thought he was just on a business trip, they later began to wonder if he actually existed. Anyway, after talking to Lulu, the police believed that Pearl must have accidentally committed suicide.
Right. Now, this was not the first time Lulu May Hollingsworth made headlines. Back in 1893, she was a student at Coates College in Terre Haute, Indiana. On Friday, February 10th of that year, Lulu simply vanished from campus and a statewide search was launched. She was just 19 years old and they feared the worst. She was tracked down after 11 days and found at 1101 North Mississippi Street in Indianapolis, which was the home of Mr. and Mrs. William James. She had changed her name to Ethel Gray and was employed in their home as a housekeeper. She positively refused to go back to school. She gave a few different reasons for her departure from the college. First, she said that she had received a $31 bill from a dry goods store called Hoberg, Root & Co., and her father was refusing to pay. That would have been equivalent to $1,150.48 today, and I can definitely see why her dad would have been pretty upset about it.
Yep.
Another reason she left was because she really didn't like school. So she wanted to do something extreme that would cause the school to refuse to let her come back. She also said that even though she loves her father and would like to see him, she really didn't want to go home. Her father, Spear Spencer Hollingsworth, had previously been the treasurer of Knox County, Indiana. The newspapers say that he had become a defaulter, and one article said that he had gotten away with $80,000 of the taxpayers' dollars, which would be close to $3 million today.
Yeah, that's wild. That's a lot of money. Holy cow. She also said that many of her classmates had pointed and stared because of what her father had done, and so she didn't want to be subjected to that. And she told the authorities in 1893 that she would do whatever it took for her father to allow her to stay in the home of the James couple. And they actually also made an argument for it because they really loved it. I guess she was great at cleaning. I don't know. But she did wind up going home with her father. But about a year before Pearl's murder, she showed back up in Indianapolis and was working as a bookkeeper. The authorities actually put her in custody, and then they went to search her room. They couldn't find any letters from any of the suspects. In fact, they couldn't find any letters at all. She received a lot of mail, but she only kept the part of the envelope that had been stamped. So she was questioned again, and this time she said Pearl had a swollen face when she saw her, and that Lulu had asked her what was wrong. Then Lulu guessed that her swollen face was due to pregnancy weight gain, and she told Pearl that she had had a similar experience herself and recently had an abortion. She said that Pearl broke down crying and told her that it was Scott Jackson who had gotten her pregnant, and that Pearl said,
"I'm going to Cincinnati to get rid of my burden. If I die, I want to be near Jackson so that he will be hanged for it, because he is responsible for my shame."
Then Lulu admitted she had gotten all of the drugs for Pearl and gave Pearl a list of other drugs to buy in Cincinnati if this attempt didn't work.
I cautioned Pearl, however, that these drugs were poisonous and must be used with great care, else they would kill her, and that she must not touch them until she had tried what I got for her.
Lulu said that Pearl said over and over that if she died, it had to be near Scott Jackson so he would suffer for what he had done to her. After getting Lulu's story, the police went to ask Scott Jackson what he knew about Lulu Mae Hollingsworth.
Who is she? The girl who last saw Pearl Bryan in Indianapolis. I've never heard of her. She formerly lived in Greencastle. I don't know her. What has she got to do with the case? She is under arrest, suspected of being implicated in the case. Pshaw.
After saying this, Scott just turned away from the bars and went to sleep. The next day, Lulu's story had changed. She said that on Tuesday the 28th, when she'd seen Pearl on her way to Cincinnati, Pearl told her that she would be coming back to Indianapolis on Thursday. Lulu said that Pearl and Alonzo Walling arrived together on that Thursday, and they got a room at the American House, and then they also went and got a room at the Fields House. And they told the owners of the Fields House to wake them up at 3:30 in the morning. Lulu was supposed to meet Pearl at the hotel at 4:30 a.m. on that Friday morning. Pearl was getting up early to go back to Cincinnati and hoped that she wouldn't run into any Greencastle friends who might, also be going to Indianapolis or whatever. Lulu Mae Hollingsworth and Pearl then walked a few blocks while talking about the pregnancy, and then they went to the Cleveland block on Kentucky Avenue. They went inside, which that means the Cleveland block must have been like a business or something. I have no idea. But they went inside, found a convenient place, and then Lulu did the operation herself with an instrument that resembled a pair of forceps with a needle attached. And it took her just a few minutes, and then they walked together to the depot, and Pearl caught her train to Cincinnati.
So much for not incriminating herself, but also she really just wants attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy. It's super crazy. And I didn't even put in all of the changes in all of her stories because it just kept evolving constantly.
Unlike our boy George.
Yeah, George stuck to it. So Lulu said that she got a letter from Scott a few days later saying that Pearl was very sick in his room and he was doing all he could. Then a couple days after that, she received another letter from Scott saying that he was in major trouble because Pearl had died and he was compelled to hide the body and mutilate it to escape responsibility. In the letter, Scott said that he had hired a black man and a closed cab to take the body across the river, and he followed them in a streetcar. He said that he and the black man carried her body to where it was found, and then the black man cut off her head with a butcher's cleaver. Lulu said that Scott went on to say that he then put the head in Pearl's valise and went back to Cincinnati alone, tossing the head into the river as he crossed the bridge. Lulu claims she did not burn that letter, but she had given it to her attorney, and she said that she refuses to produce the letter until she's satisfied that it will be necessary to clear herself of any charges or to save Scott and Alonzo from being hanged. At this point, the police are wondering if they had a mental patient in their jail. The next day, February 11th, they released her from custody. The newspaper said,
"If she is not crazy, she is a stupendous liar."
The newspaper article didn't stop there.
It is surmised that the girl has had access to the daily papers and that she has changed her statements from day to day to conform to the developments at Cincinnati.
Lulu may have been released from the Indianapolis jail after 2 days, but she wasn't finished with the Pearl Bryan case just yet. Lulu didn't want to leave. She didn't like that she'd simply been dismissed. In an angry huff, she told the police just how much she was still involved by unveiling what may have been the most dramatic plan anyone had proposed thus far.
Do tell.
She announced that she would leave for Cincinnati the following day, but exactly when and on which train would remain a closely guarded secret. She would arrive incognito, she said, register at a quiet hotel under an assumed name, and attend the trial every single day with her face concealed behind a black veil. Then, at the dramatic conclusion of the proceedings, she would rise from the gallery, walk confidently to the bar of justice, and reveal her true identity. She would announce that she was none other than Lulu May Hollingsworth of Indianapolis. Then she would produce the letter Scott Jackson had supposedly written to her, the one that she said her attorney had in his possession. The one in which Scott Jackson said that he was trying to save Pearl's life after she'd taken an abortion cocktail, and when she died, he had simply cut off her head to hide his own part in the disaster. The letter would be read aloud in open court, she said. The truth would finally be known, and Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling would both walk free. The officers repeatedly told Lulu it's time to leave, but she ignored them. And she probably even spoke over them to continue with her tirade. So she stood her ground just long enough to finish describing her extraordinary plan in every last dramatic detail, and then she made her exit. Only then were the police finally rid of her.
What I find interesting is that she has this letter, and it's gonna free them. But wouldn't her having given her the abortion pills at the time been illegal?
Yes, but she changed that story. The most recent version was that she met her in the morning at 4:30 at the hotel, and then they walked to this place and found a convenient spot, and then she did the abortion on her herself.
Okay, so that would still be illegal.
Correct. That would still be illegal.
So she's trying to free them, but also go to prison herself.
I guess so. Yeah, because she would if that was true. She's
She's kind of an idiot.
Yeah. Yeah.
She wants to be popular and famous. I mean, who doesn't? That's why we're doing this podcast. Kidding. But she also was like, I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to tell you all about it. And you won't remember. And then it's going to happen and you'll all be surprised.
I know. Like I think she wrote that letter from H-E-R, right? She wrote the letter. And I think she knew very well, when they came, it was probably just a blank piece of paper folded up. So she could walk in and then throw it into the fire real quick and then be like, it was nothing,
Yeah, yeah.
Because she needs them to be like, tell us, what was it? What was it? Yeah, it's
narcissist.
It's so crazy. It's like crazy. And of course, with her announcing, I will be dressed all in black and I'm going to have this veil and then I'll tell people who I am. It's like, you just did. They're all going to know. There she is again.
Oh, Lulu,
So
back at it.
Yep. And I looked her up. I texted you about this. Did you see this?
I did.
So I looked her up, and several years later, she owned a boarding house in Indianapolis, and one of her boarders got really, really sick. And so there were doctors at the house trying to help him. And then she was in the other room, fainting and having, all of this, her own little medical emergency. So they would tend to her while that was going on. So
how dare that boarder take the attention away?
I know. Yeah. And the papers weren't fooled. They were like, Lulu May Hollingsworth of Pearl Bryan fame, and then go on about the
back at it.
Yep. Everything she was doing. And then I saw she got married for the first and only time in 1912 when she was 37, I think it said. And she died within a few months. And it makes me wonder if her husband was like, you are so obnoxious. Let's just hurry this along. And then he was married to at least 2 other people and had a bunch of kids, but none with her. So, yeah, she seems like quite the character. So anyway, you see that Scott Jackson has a story, Alonzo Walling has a story, George H. Jackson has a story, William Wood has a story, Mae Smith has a story, and Lulu May Hollingsworth has a plethora of stories. I mean, even Heck and Avery's New Dime Museum has a story. Everyone has a story. And this is where we'll leave their stories for now. Next time, we'll return to Heckin Avery's New Dime Museum, where a Brahmin from India uses incense to conduct his own forensic investigation. Detectives continue chasing new leads, new witnesses keep emerging, newly uncovered evidence begins to reveal the true story, with a question mark, and the investigation grows stranger than anyone could have imagined.
A message was brought back to her home that poor Pearl Bryan was dead, killed by Walling and Jackson, and they took away her head.
Are we into March?
Oh yeah, we're into March. I've read
we made
into
it
March.
out of February.
Actually, no, I don't think this story made it out of February. Hang on, what day was that they released her? February 11th. So, we have not here gotten into March. I, in my notes, have gotten into March.
And next time, we'll get into March.
We will get in, I promise you. We will get into March.
This story is a lot more twisty and turny than I thought it would be when I found it.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. And I'm
Is it
sure
your new favorite?
I don't know. It's really good. They're all so good. But yeah, no, it's just incredible how much happened. And I know that there are documentaries out there. I know that there are books and stuff. I personally have not seen any of it. I had never heard of this before. But I can see why it is still talked about, because it's like madness. It really was the crime of the century, I think.
Okay. Shout out to newspapers.com, ancestry.com, findagrave.com, familysearch.com, pixabay.com.
Shout out to Smithsonian Folkways Records again for allowing us to use the Pearl Bryan folk song.
Shout out to Christian.
Heck yeah.
Someone hire him so you have that chocolate-coated thunder.
Yeah. I think caramel-coated thunder, I think is what he said. We should make a shirt or something, you know?
His birthday's next month.
Oh.
Follow our socials, especially our Facebook page where we are most active.
Mm-hmm.
Leave us a review, please. It boosts our podcast so more people find us.
Yay.
And if you know people who love history and true crime, send them our way.
Yes, please do.
And you can email us at forgottenfelonies@gmail.com. You can make requests.
Mm-hmm.
Or just send us articles of cool, interesting cases you find.
Yeah.
And then if we do it, we'll give you a shout out. So, but yes, especially if you want to see pictures from this episode, follow the Facebook.
1895, when she went to the Ohio Dental College to get her teeth filled. He filled 10 teeth for her over the next...
Oh.
I know! Well,
Whoa.
dude, get this. At one point, a skull had been found, and they were like, we found a skull, and Scott was like, oh, it should be really easy to identify. She was missing 9 teeth. I know!
Pearl was missing 9 teeth?
Pearl was missing 9 teeth.
Whoa.
Yeah, maybe dentistry was in its infancy. Just craziness. But yeah, so anyway, yeah,